Welcome to the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. I'm your host, Jacob Cooper, best-selling author of Life After Breath and the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. For those of you who are new to the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder, we welcome you on. Please consider hitting that subscribe button as well as bell notification icon to stay up to date and help build the algorithm to create more of a community, more awareness around profound conversations with inspiring experts and guests coming your way. You could also follow us here on mindbodyspirit.fm for the audio syndicated podcast. Today's guest in the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder is a very special guest. His name is Dr. Dawson Church. Dr. Dawson Church is really one of the experts in the field of research of neuroscience and psychology. He really is an expert on the brain and the body, understanding somatization, best-selling author as well. So again, you're going to be getting a lot of information and tools to really maximize the brain, maximize mental health, and as well as understanding the mind and body and spirit connection on your pathway. So we have a lot of brilliant content coming your way that's going to be very practical and helpful for many of you listening. So without further ado, we bring on the brilliant Dr. Dawson Church on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. Dr. Dawson Church, it is a lifetime honor to have you here on the Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder. I am so excited to bring you on, and I know this interview is going to be so helpful for many of my viewers. For those probably who know me, my clients or my own backstory, I am obsessed with really using my brain or higher conscious to really understand the brain, because I do believe, that we're missing so much education on the brain. Now, you've devoted a whole career within the mental health field, and really studying the brain, and have quite an impressive resume. But for viewers who haven't heard Dr. Church, you are in for a treat today during this conversation. And I know there's going to be something that you're going to be taking with you that's going to be transformative in your everyday life. But Dr. Dawson Church, man, I am just completely floored to have you on my channel. Could you tell us, for viewers who aren't familiar with your backstory, a little bit of the work that you're currently doing and how we got there? Because I'm sure there was a lot of roads and twists and turns, but what's your why? Like, how did you, what's beyond the passion, the incredible groundbreaking work that you're leading today in your work?
Well, to go from now to then, my newest book is called Spiritual Intelligence, and I am defining and describing this whole emerging field of research of spiritual intelligence. And it's really a remarkable field. The first studies were done in the 1990s, and they show that people with a strong spirituality, literally that characteristic produced changes in gene expression in their bodies. Genes change, dozens of genes change expression. It's not the genes you have that counts, it's whether they're turned on or turned off, whether they're silenced or expressed. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that spiritual intelligence was having massive effects in terms of gene expression in the body. But how I got there was as a child, I was really alienated. My parents moved a lot. I was rarely in the same school for more than a few months, and bouncing around. My father was a missionary, so he traveled a lot. And I wound up feeling pretty disconnected by the time I was a teenager. And I was depressed and suicidal, as a lot of teenagers are. And I went and joined a spiritual community when I was 15 years old. And there I began to have transcendent experiences. And also I studied the world's perennial philosophy. Like, I was reading authors like Ram Dass and Alan Watts and Aldous Huxley, looking at the commonalities, the common components to all the world's religions, and then starting to have these transcendent experiences myself. And then went through a number of phases, but wound up becoming a researcher and an author. And I wrote a really pivotal book, and it was called The Genie in Your Genes, in the early 2000s. And I linked these shifts in consciousness, like releasing trauma, like attaining elevated states, to changes in the body, down to the level of the genes. So we're going below the level of neurotransmitters, below the level of hormones, the level of gene expression, molecular biology. And what we again are finding is that shifts in consciousness are producing these massive changes in the body and especially in the brain. So I did it initially out of a sense of as a teenager looking for answers to my own problems, and then as an adult as I apply these techniques getting a lot happier. And then I also began to bring trauma treatment into mainstream settings. So me and my volunteers and our nonprofit have done many presentations at places like Kaiser, many VA hospitals, Cleveland Clinic. We're now training people, for example, in various VA hospitals in these trauma relief methods that I helped pioneer and study. And so we're now finding these powerful techniques. We can literally take people with complex PTSD, and within 4 to 10 sessions, their nightmares are gone, their flashbacks are gone, their hypervigilance is gone. And not just one study, but I mean dozens of clinical trials, meta-analyses of really robust evidence base, and thousands of stories of people who've just got their lives back after this. So that's really what motivates me, is to help make a difference in people's lives and in society by being in the VA, by we're training, for example, now therapists and school teachers in Ukraine to work with traumatized people there. We've trained therapists and counselors in Rwanda, in Haiti, many other parts of the world. So that's really the scope of what I'm up to now. And my more recent research again is on spiritual intelligence and these high states of consciousness. So that's just a very quick summary of many decades of experience and work.
Absolutely. It speaks volume for the man that you are, where you seem like you were able to utilize the pain that you went through during those teenage years as a segue to a deepened sense of purpose and empathy to understand those that you're now impacting in your work.
It's interesting. I had an experience that was where the rubber met the road when in 2017 I was scheduled to do a presentation on trauma. I was scheduled to do a professional trauma training at a conference, and it was late in the year. I was due to do this presentation in October of 2017, and I spoke at this conference for many years, and I had done these trauma trainings for about 15 years, and training therapists, training coaches, training mental health professionals, and also non-professionals to work with clients who are traumatized and release all of these really debilitating symptoms. So I had this scheduled, and then on October 9th, 2017, my plans were disrupted because my house burned down. I was trapped in a wildfire. My wife and I just barely escaped with our lives. And I tell that story in my book, Bliss Brain. And we just went through this horrendous disruption. We literally were driving out as as the trees above our head were bursting into flames. We lost everything we owned. 5,000 houses burned that year. That particular fire, it was at that point the worst wildfire in California history. Now there've been even worse ones since 2017, but at that point it was the biggest wildfire. Dozens of people died. It was just a horrendous experience, a dislocating experience. And then in the year after that, I found I was grappling with ill health. We had a huge financial loss the following year. So it looked like our lives were in wreckage. And yet every morning as I meditated and as I'd been applying these PTSD techniques myself, I found I was really happy. So I wrote the book Bliss Brain about being in elevated states of connection with the infinite, the consciousness beyond our local consciousness. And we live in this field of consciousness. And I'm always struck when I read the work of consciousness researchers saying, well, where is consciousness? Where is it in the brain? Where is it located? It's like a fish asking, where's the water? We live in a sea of consciousness. And in my earlier book, Mind to Matter, I present all the scientific evidence showing that the material world arises from consciousness, and consciousness literally changes the material world. And there are hundreds of studies to show that it does this in various ways. So how do we let go of our clinging to our individual, small, local consciousness and surrender, as the
Mhm.
mystics do, as some of the great historical figures do, like MLK and Gandhi. I mean, these were people who surrendered to something greater than themselves, and in that surrender comes a flood of compassion, joy, peace. And now I'm studying this empirically, and it turns out to have absolutely stunning effects on our brain. It literally, through neuroplasticity, it turns on all kinds of circuits and networks in our brains and radically reshapes our body, dramatically improves our longevity, and upgrades our health. So I had that experience myself of the fire, losing everything, applying these methods. And now in the most current research I'm doing, we're providing empirical evidence for just how much this changes the body, changes the brain.
Remarkable. And, from one therapist to another, and I work in the field of mental health, um, I'm often asked during interviews, well, we have a lot more access to mental health providers on the internet and online therapists. And yet, to a degree, there's a lot more acuity these days, despite more access. And we could point to a lot of plethora of avenues. My question for you is, would you say that spirituality or talk therapy in general has a degree of limitations and these other modalities should be included, in as in therapeutic practice? Like, is that one of the missing links that you're finding, that there's a certain limitation of just talk therapy?
I'm laughing because there is a movement in the American Psychological Association now to define psychotherapy
Mm,
in a way that excludes any somatic component, that
mhm,
excludes any body based component. And again, that's just a really remarkable development after we've been researching the mind body connection and
mhm,
had thousands of studies about that over the last 50 years. That there's this movement to try and actually rule that if a psychotherapeutic method includes a somatic component, then it's not psychotherapy and shouldn't be defined as that.
yes,
And our bodies and minds are intricately linked. Our spirituality affects both body and mind. And the missing piece is that somatic piece. What we find in both meditation research and also we find this in therapy research, is that you have to move into the body. And I'll give you a historical example of a psychiatrist who was really famous in the 50s. His name was Joseph Walpe, and he was tasked in one of his assignments with working with veterans of World War II. So here he had these men who'd been on Omaha Beach, who'd been in the invasion of Normandy, and he had these populations of soldiers, and they were terribly impaired. They had all the symptoms of PTSD, and he was a therapist. He was a therapist. He was a Freudian as well as a psychiatrist, and so he thought, well, we know what Freud says: the talking cure. Lay them on the couch,
mhm,
have them talk. And he wrote in his book later, in his book, The Practice of Behavior Therapy, he said, this type of therapy, talk therapy with these traumatized veterans, was not only unhelpful, it was harmful. Now, why was
mm,
it harmful? And then, of course, in the 80s and 90s, we discovered the whole phenomenon of re traumatization, telling your trauma story over and over again. The talk therapy approach then can leave people re traumatized because it's lighting up all those neural pathways in their brain again. But what we've also discovered through the research now into memory reconsolidation and memory and emotional extinction around those memories is that if you introduce, while the person is talking about that, what Joseph Wolpe found in 1948, 1952, he tried everything. He tried all kinds of different psychotherapeutic approaches. One thing worked, and that one thing was breathing, breath work.
wow,
If those veterans were talking about Omaha Beach and they stayed in touch with their breathing, if they stayed in their bodies, then they didn't dissociate and they healed. So that was our very first inclination, our very first indication that a somatic component of body healing is the key to a lot of trauma release. Now, there are some kinds of conditions which talk therapy is highly useful, and we train people in things like family constellation therapy and other forms of therapy. But we also add in that component of
Mhm.
a somatic experience. Usually we use acupressure. There are other techniques as well, but we have people simply rub or tap acupuncture points on their bodies, and it's absolutely amazing. I watched one young veteran, for example. He was in his early 30s. He'd been deployed in Iraq, and I was working with him in a really beautiful campus. And yet, when somebody walked into the room we were in and had a water bottle in their hands, a plastic water bottle, and they crinkled it, they just
Mhm.
crushed it with their hands, making this crackling sound. This veteran got so triggered, he was ready to dive under the table. He was just triggered by the sound of this crackling bottle like it was gunfire. So he was again, his brain was just on the alert for anything that might be construed as a threat. And as I had him talk about the experiences in Iraq, the firefights, losing his friends, dead civilians, the stench of decomposing corpses. I mean, it was not an easy thing to deal with. I was, in fact, using acupressure on myself as well because I was getting triggered just by the intensity of his experiences. But as he tapped and breathed and recounted these terrible experiences, but stayed in his body, his emotional triggering went down. And we had an easy way to test whether the treatment had been effective. We simply got a plastic water bottle, crinkled it again, and he was at a zero in terms of emotional triggering. That happens really, really quickly with veterans. And through our Veteran Stress Project, we've now given free treatment over 20,000 veterans in the last 15 years. And again, we've seen their levels of PTSD symptoms plummet. So we now know that it's possible to release even deep seated, long held trauma. And we know that the vital ingredient is that people feel safe in their bodies. If they don't feel safe in their bodies, no matter what you do at the level of the mind, it's not going to get down deep into their cells. And when it does get deep into their cells, that's when we see neural pathways changing. In some of my research, we see cortisol, the stress hormone cortisol, absolutely plummeting. In my very first big cortisol study in the late, like around 2008, 2009, we were sending these cortisol samples off to the lab to be analyzed after a 1 hour session. And this was a very complex, uh, triple blind,
Mhm.
randomized controlled trial. We were mailing these cortisol samples up to the lab to have them analyzed, and they were from a talk therapy group, they were from an acupressure tapping group, and they were from a no treatment group. And the the cortisol samples went to the lab to get analyzed, and they didn't come back on time. And I was really wondering what was holding them up, why the lab wasn't getting me their results back like they normally did within a couple of days. And eventually I phoned the lab director and he said, Dr. Church, there's something really anomalous going on here. We're running and rerunning the tests, but they're showing in one of your three groups, the acupressure group, we're showing that the cortisol is dropping so far, so fast, it's not possible. We concluded there must be a mistake with our machines, and we're recalibrating them, and we're running the tests over and over again. So the
Mhm.
lab could not believe how quickly cortisol dropped, and that's how quickly your stress drops when you introduce those physiological therapies. You introduce those physical cues, it affects our body physiologically. So that's the huge insight in therapy. A veteran that might have taken a year to treat in, say, a VA
Mhm.
PTSD program, um, our advanced therapists in the VA are treating that same veteran in 3 sessions, 5 sessions, at most 10 sessions. And they're walking out of there, the flashbacks are gone, the nightmares are gone, the hypervigilance is gone. They've just got their lives back after these very, very brief somatic treatments.
Hmm. You know, in inter cross sections of medicine and therapy, you're seeing some underlying themes, and I don't want this to be like, a conversation we're going at, the powers that be, but when something is new, and his healing is effective, it's not necessarily embraced. And in fact, it could be quite dangerous. If you
No
find a
kidding,
cure,
Jacob.
if you find a cure to cancer, all of a sudden, like you're taken out, in a couple of weeks for whatever reason, and you're seeing that with therapy, but with something that's so effective and there's evidence base behind the hard research. Why do you feel the powers that be are just not totally embracive of
Yeah,
something that's
I mean,
so impactful to
in one of my
clients?
papers, I calculated the costs of veteran treatment of PTSD over the next cycle, and it's over $1 trillion, trillion with a
Mm,
T. I mean, it's an enormous
mm,
expense. You think that the VA would have been all over this, and they haven't. And what I see is institutional inertia. I don't think there's any great plot. I mean, people say, "Oh, the pharmaceutical companies are trying to suppress new therapies," and I think they have better things to do with their time. But what I think that you have is just people learn what they learned in medical school and they keep on doing that for the next 50 years of their career. And so what you see throughout history, the history of medicine going back centuries, is that there's this long delay between the discovery and patients getting it. How long? Well, the government has measured this and found that it's about 17 years before medical innovation reaches patients. And in their research, they find that only one innovation in five ever reaches patients. The other four are lost. So we faced enormous opposition getting this acupressure therapy into the VA. It took us 10 years of knocking at their door and persisting. And we had members of Congress writing to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to insist that they look at these therapies. And so, yeah, these big institutions have a lot of inertia around what they're used to doing, which
mhm,
is prescribing drugs for the most part. You find a condition, you go get a prescription for it. And they have a very hard time believing that something as simple as breathing or deep meditation or acupressure can be producing these massive effects in the body. But the research is there, and if anyone takes a
right,
look at it, like on my site, EFT Universe, you're going to find over 200 clinical trials showing that this method is effective for anxiety, depression,
mhm,
phobias, weight loss. We, for example, have several weight loss studies showing not short-term weight loss, long-term weight loss
mhm,
after applying this. So, yeah, we have these therapies available to us. They're making their way slowly into the mainstream. When they hit in a big way, we're going to find a huge number of people who now have diagnoses like anxiety, depression, PTSD. It rarely takes more than a few sessions to clear anxiety or depression. Again, PTSD, the research shows it's between 4 and 10 sessions. So we
wow,
have these tools now in public health. It's kind of like a century ago when we had the tools to eradicate polio and typhoid and dysentery. And then we forget that back then, a century ago, there was huge opposition from the establishment
mhm,
into implementing those tools. But eventually they did get implemented, and then suddenly, what is typhoid? What is diphtheria? None of us even know what those diseases look like now. Say it'll be the same for the next generation with anxiety, depression, PTSD. A few people will still have those diagnoses, but will have the tools to actually shift many segments of society. In Rwanda, for example, using this with the survivors of the 1994 genocide,
mhm,
we've done many programs. Our volunteers have gone to Rwanda, number of times worked with orphans of the genocide, starting around 1999. And the research there, many studies show that their PTSD symptoms, even from a horrendous event like watching your parents get hacked to death with machetes in front of your eyes. I mean, that is about as bad as it gets for a
wow,
5 year old. And even people who have these enormously traumatic experiences were able to work successfully with them. Their lives just change radically. So we have these tools now. Our big challenge in next is implementation and acceptance.
mhm. Yeah, it takes a lot for overhauls of institutions, but I'm noticing a slow infiltration of Eastern practices within evidence-based practice. I mean, for instance, there's a practice I'm sure you're familiar with, Marsha Lenehan's DBT,
Yes.
dialectical behavioral therapy. She was a professor, I believe, at the University of Washington. She might have been diagnosed or self-diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and she integrated a lot of mindfulness and MBSR and radical acceptance. And I think that's great. But yes, certainly I'm hopeful, to stop feeling like we're walking on a tightrope as a therapist, and we're able to actually integrate this and have full support with the APA, and the boards. Because, look, it's not about the ego. It's not about fearing the unknown. It's about really focusing on what's working, what's most effective, and leaving the rest out. But maybe
Yeah.
that's wishful thinking for now. But people like you are changing that. For viewers who are skeptical of, all this stuff, where they just feel like, hey, you know what, I'm just my thoughts. I don't believe that the brain has anything to do with this. Meditation is just kind of silly and stupid. Like, it doesn't change anything. Like, what are some, to reiterate, like, what are some of the hard evidences that really will correlate brain health and mental health? Because I think it's important to spell it out, intangibilize some of these things. So, what are some correlationships between the health of our brain and the mental status of our lives?
There are a number of things that our brain does by recruiting various circuits in the brain. And a century ago, the whole model of brain function was regions of the brain. There was a region for speech and a region for writing and a region for creativity. Now we know that the brain works together in the form of circuits and networks that collaborate with each other. And in my book, Bliss Brain, and in my new book, Spiritual Intelligence,
Mm,
I have people focus first on one particular circuit, and that is the emotion regulation
mm,
circuit. And it's a very well understood circuit. We know what those components of it are. And what it does is it regulates all the different components of the brain that process emotion. And this is incredibly important because if you are at the mercy of your emotions, then every time you get triggered, you react. And when you react, your cortisol goes up and your adrenaline goes up. And we find that people who are highly reactive, highly driven by negative emotion causes all kinds of long term ill effects. And it accelerates Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and other
mm,
degenerative diseases in the brain. So, in one study, they found that, for example, looking at Alzheimer's plaques in the brain, that they looked at every single component that could contribute to Alzheimer's, from um, lifestyle to diet to gene expression, because there are two genes called the apogenes that are highly correlated with the development of Alzheimer's. So they looked at
mm,
all of these, the genes, diet, lifestyle, everything, and they found the biggest correlation between the buildup of Alzheimer's plaques in the brain and another factor was negative thinking.
mm,
That was more important and more influential over the development of Alzheimer's than the genes, lifestyle, and every other factor that the researchers looked at. And the more negative thinking people had, the higher the deposit of Alzheimer's plaques in the brain. So there are very, very direct correlations between how you use your consciousness and what happens in your body and your long-term longevity and survival. I did one study myself. It was a randomized controlled trial, get the gold standard of research. And I developed a very simple method called eco meditation in 2009. And it's been used in a number of studies now. It's spread widely all over the world. And it's very simple and it's evidence based because it has just 5 components to it, which are all based on various good studies. So you do these 5 somatic things in your body. You breathe a certain way, relax certain muscles. And so when you do these somatic things to your body, with your body, you then move into these elevated states as you do eco meditation. And we looked at people doing eco meditation for 1 month versus a control group who was doing a similar placebo mindfulness track.
mhm,
And we found after 1 month that there were structural, anatomical changes in the brain, picked up on a high intensity MRI, high resolution MRI. Now, think about that. Just after only a month of doing a 20-minute a day meditation track, you have structural changes in your brain. That's huge. And some of the areas affected were those to do with emotion regulation. And so the part of the brain that handles that is involved with positive emotion, gratitude, awe, wonder, happiness, compassion, altruism. That part of the brain was really active after a month of this. The part of the brain that has to do with suffering was really inactive after a month of this. And these were structural and functional changes within the brain in just 1 month. So read the research. There are lots of other studies. And in my new book, Spiritual Intelligence, the frontier of this research is applying these somatic meditation methods with Alzheimer's patients.
Mm.
Alzheimer's brains shrink. The normal human brain between 40 and 85 shrinks about 25%. Okay, that's a big shrinkage between 40,
Wow.
age 40, age 85, shrinks 25%. The Alzheimer's brain can shrink up to 70%.
Mm.
So these Alzheimer's brains are tiny. They're these little walnuts rattling around in the skull after, after 30, 40, 50 years of Alzheimer's. And we found in these most recent studies described in Spiritual Intelligence in the book that as people did these somatic meditations, the emotion regulation parts of their brains began to grow. The memory and learning centers began to grow. The executive control centers of the brain stopped shrinking, and not only stopped shrinking, but began to grow. So that's what you want to do. Now, you don't want to wait till you have Alzheimer's to start figuring this out and
Mhm.
doing it. I, we can pick up, researchers can pick up the 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 prevalence of Alzheimer's in your body. It shows up in your brain and your blood 30 plus years before any symptoms appear. So
Wow.
we can look at the blood of a 30-year-old and we can tell how likely it is they'll develop Alzheimer's based on what their blood work looks like right now. We can predict 30 years from now what their symptom
Mm.
likelihood is. So you want to start now. Don't wait till you have, some sort of
Oh,
health crisis
absolutely.
and then do it. Do it for your own brain health right now, because again, you're building memory and learning centers. How fast? In one of the case studies in Spiritual Intelligence, we have a guy who starts doing meditation and he's never meditated before, has MRIs done before he begins, goes back after 2 months to the same advanced lab, gets a second MRI scan. The emotion regulation core of his brain in 2 months has grown by 23%. Okay. Massive brain growth as a result of that meditation practice. So
Mm.
it's rapidly improving your emotion regulation. Then you aren't reactive. Bad things happen. I mean, there are wildfires and there are political
Mhm.
storms and there are all the inequality in society and all these upheavals, and it's not like that it affect you, but you can regulate negative emotion. You aren't just
Mhm.
flying off the handle and letting your own internal mood be driven by those external circumstances. So that is how quickly meditation can change the brain.
Mm.
23% in 8 weeks in the case of that emotion regulation circuit.
Wow. So you heard it yourself, viewers, and I know mindfulness and meditation is a bit of a buzzword these days, which sometimes goes on deaf ears. But I think hearing the hard research of how it can change your brain and the lifelong impacts it could have on your path that you just illustrated, I think are profound to take notice of. Now, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of different forms of meditations from mindfulness, TM, all that stuff. Is for viewers listening or watching, are there particular meditations that you would recommend for people to really activate all these things that you're talking about and maybe change some of the wiring neurologically and even biologically, as you mentioned too, right?
Yeah, and what we found with eco meditation, this very simple method I developed in 2009, and which there's quite a bit of research behind this now, including that brain study. And
Mhm.
what we find is that you can layer in those somatic techniques of eco meditation. They're free on the web. Just go to
Mhm.
ecomeditation.com, ecomeditation.com, download the tracks there, and you'll find that the basic routine takes about 5 minutes. So people who do mindfulness meditation or do vipassana or do tonglen or who are doing even yoga or qigong or other moving meditations,
Mhm.
they simply layer in these somatic methods into what they're doing now. and
Mhm.
that tends to really accelerate the effects of whatever else they do. So there are lots of styles of meditation. Some people like a really active meditation. My wife, for example, loves yoga. I tend to prefer other forms of movement, not yoga. I like qigong more.
Mhm.
She likes yoga more. So find what works for you, but then layer in those physiological methods in eco meditation. We give you breathing, very simple breathing exercises. We give you some simple relaxation
Mhm.
exercises, and those are going to affect your body. And so, whatever else that really works for you,
Mhm.
add those in, layer them in, and use that 5 minute intervention to really shift yourself, and then you'll find that it'll turbocharge whatever other form of meditation you use.
Love it. Well, it's kind of like an out of left field question, but I work a lot with children's and teenagers, dealing with various different levels of acuity, as well as private practice. And I've noticed throughout the years, I'd say the last 5, 6 years, with the pandemic and everything, there's been a great shift of acuity. I mean, I've seen a lot more high risk behaviors, but in just, things just seems to intensify. I'm wondering for you, like, what do you feel the current social media age that we're living in, as well as the political and social climate that we're in with so much divisiveness, hostility, combativeness, how has that all shifted or impacted the brain from this current times that we're in, social media technology, all these things, and how is that impacting the brain?
Well, garbage in, garbage out. What you put in your consciousness is what your consciousness is then full of. And if you're absorbing all kinds of negative media and influences, music, people, toxic
Mhm.
situations, if that's what you're placing in your consciousness,
Mhm.
then you're going to have a pretty junky consciousness, and you're going to produce pretty junky effects in the world around you. So, what we find is that as people learn to wean themselves from that, pull out of that. And meditators naturally tend to start to do this. They look at how can I fill my mind, my
Mhm.
awareness, my field of consciousness with positive influences. So both ends of the spectrum are true. A study published actually this week showed that when young boys are exposed to a lot of violent imagery
Mhm.
in movies and video games early in life, they have much more of that violent
Mhm.
ideation in their lives as adults. So again, putting your consciousness in these kinds of environments is going to produce effects later on.
Mhm.
And meditators naturally tend to start to gravitate toward a much more peaceful content of consciousness. You'd rather put on a movie that's going to deeply satisfy you and nurture
Mhm.
your soul. You'd rather take a course that builds you up rather than go and engage in any kind of content that's going to disturb your inner peace. Your inner peace becomes really precious to you when you've lived with it for a while. And I think back, I mean, I have my good days and bad days, and sometimes I have bad days and I'm worried about things, and I'm kind of sucked back into the despair that I used to experience as my whole reality when I was 20 or 30 years old. And I think I look back at those experiences in my younger days and I think, wow, that guy back then was just suffering so much, and he wasn't discriminating or filtering what was going into his consciousness.
Mhm.
Nowadays I'm really careful about what books I read, what movies I watch, what content I consume, because I just basically am living in the state that in the Eastern scriptures is called samadhi, the state of bliss, being consciousness bliss, sat chit ananda in Sanskrit. And when you're living in being consciousness bliss, you just find your predilection for violent content is zero. And you find all kinds of things change around you. You choose your friends based on how loving and kind and compassionate and warm and emotionally and spiritually intelligent they are. Suddenly you find you have a whole different group of friends. Maybe you're with a partner or a husband or a wife, and they
Mhm.
aren't quite on the same wavelength as you. What will happen is either you'll move closer together and they'll go the same wavelength as you, or you're going to move further apart and maybe choose somebody else to be with. So
Mhm.
there are all kinds of effects that start to happen in your outer life your friendships, your close relationships, and even the ones that can't be fixed. I mean, maybe like, for example, one of my dear friends has a son, adult son, who is
Mhm,
a drug addict and who's been stealing from him over
mhm,
the course of many, many years.
mhm,
He can't fix his son. His son is the way he is, but
mhm,
he holds his son in compassion. He has clear boundaries and he has compassion. So you move into compassion for even the perpetrators of things in the world. I think about the warmongers of today, the people who are making war, who are causing the suffering, maiming, and death of hundreds of people or thousands of people.
mhm,
And how do I hold them in my heart? How do I feel about them? I'm obviously appalled by the carnage that they're wreaking in the world, and yet I maintain that sense of equilibrium using that emotion regulation circuit. And the cool thing about having an active emotion regulation circuit is you can use it not just to dial down negative emotion, but dial up positive emotion. So we find that these long-term meditators have extremely high levels of the brain waves that indicate joy,
mhm,
gratitude, awe, wonder, compassion. And in Sanskrit, those states are called Vishoka, sorrowless joy, Ananda, utter ecstasy. And they're living in ecstasy even among chaos. And you
mhm,
look at the lives of some of these mystics, like the Dalai Lama. He
mhm,
hasn't had an easy life. He was forced to flee his homeland when the Chinese army invaded Tibet. So many of them have had enormous losses, enormous tragedies in their lives. And we find it leads to not post-traumatic stress disorder, it leads to post-traumatic growth.
mhm,
And the research shows that two-thirds of people who go through a traumatic event actually move into post-traumatic growth. A third
mhm,
move into PTSD. But the more common experience is for that trauma to literally catalyze meaning, finding purpose in your life. So even the worst things in your life can be good, but you certainly are then going to seek out people and music and literature
mhm.
and visual stimuli that are going to foster that sense of peace and love and joy inside of you, just the way it is expressing outside of you. And once you've tasted these states, those states of Vishoka, Ananda, you never want to go back. In fact, my wife and I have pretty much quit traveling. We used to travel all over the world, and used to teach in Europe every summer, and we can reach people via Zoom nowadays. So that's how we do it. But also, when you're able to sit on your meditation cushion in your living room and be in samadhi, your desire to move your body to Bali is just going to diminish because all you're doing in Bali is sitting on a meditation and being samadhi, or in Paris or in Rome.
Mhm.
So you're in these extraordinary mental states, and
Right,
a
right.
lot of the trivial stuff just becomes much less important in your life.
Yeah, well, I'm laughing because a lot of people are obsessed with the routes and not understanding that they have access to the destinations. I think we give ourselves permission to those destinations by opening up some of these routes, but we could activate it. It's all internal. You don't have to go to an ashram to have. You can, but all those things are inside of you. It's not like you go there and you'll find it over there. That thing is always there. You're just opening up. So I love what you said because so many people cling to what they, like there's an outside versus inside reality where people depend on external circumstances for inner experiences. And people are connected, really are tuned into their inner experiences and how that reflects itself to their outer world. So amazing. I know you mentioned PTSD, and why is it that we as a society tend to gravitate towards or fixate or have something so clear in our memory that's something that's so negative rather than the majority of people who could also have that polar opposite experience that's positive in their lives as something that, they hold near and dear. I mean, it seems like negativity seems to be almost addictive and have such a it just kind of sticks with so many people. And obviously there's a neuro explanation for it, but you'd say it's possible for people to be hooked onto negative things just as it's possible for people to be, in tune with the positive elements of their life. Is that correct?
Well, I explain that in spiritual intelligence by giving the example of two hypothetical sisters 100,000 years ago, and I call them Hug and Gug. And they're
Mhm,
living in a village, a Paleolithic Stone Age village. And their job is to go from the village to the stream every day and collect water and bring it back up to the village. And even though they look very much the same, they're sisters, they have very different personalities. And Hug is really sunny and cheerful and bright and optimistic. Gug is the exact opposite. And she is pessimistic, she's paranoid, and that's because she has a mutation of a gene that turns on the production of cortisol and adrenaline a nanosecond quicker than the rest of her tribe. So she has this gene mutation that makes her the way she is, pessimistic
mhm,
and depressed. And so they are doing their route every day. And God, being paranoid, is looking down the path, they're going toward the river and looking for snakes and spiders and tigers and all these bad things. And Hug's saying, we've done this trip 10,000 times. We've never run into anything bad. Why are you so paranoid about this? So Gug is making the mistake every day of seeing imaginary tigers and seeing imaginary snakes and looking out for the spiders when there really are no or very, very minimal threats. And
mhm,
Hug is not. So Gug is making the paranoid person's mistake. But Hug is really attuned to all the beautiful sounds and sights and surroundings and smelling the flowers.
mhm,
Then one day, they're walking down the path and there really is a hungry tiger and it growls. They look there, they drop their girds and run away. Except Gug, because she has this paranoid gene mutation, her cortisol and adrenaline spikes a nanosecond earlier, and she runs faster than Hug and escapes.
mhm,
So that paranoid gene survives. The happy gene is becomes the tiger's lunch. So that's what happened to our ancestors, and repeat that over hundreds and then thousands of generations. And you have people like us who are capable of sitting here in a beautiful space with everything, every material need fulfilled, and worrying ourselves to death and raising our own
mhm,
cortisol and adrenaline. And that's the brain's negativity bias. That's the way our brains are structured. And we have to learn to counteract this. And the good news I share in spiritual intelligence is you have specific circuits in your brain. You have emotion regulation. There are three others that neuroscientists have discovered that if you turn these on, will predispose you to well-being, happiness, gratitude, joy, and will counteract the brain's negativity bias. It'll start growing those happiness circuits, and you're going to get happier and happier and happier. So we now have, because of neuroscience, have the tools to know not just that our brains have this predisposition to disaster,
mhm,
but what they also have is these joy circuits, these compassion circuits, and that certain things just flip them on like turning on a light switch. So we turn them on over and over and over again. Again, in that case history I mentioned, that emotion regulation circuit component grows 23% in 2 months. So
mhm,
those parts start to grow. And we find ourselves in these extraordinary states, like that state of Ashoka and Ananda I mentioned earlier. And so that is what we can learn to do. It's a learned behavior. We inherited the negativity bias from our ancestors, but neuroscience has now shown us we also have all of these structures in our brains that can make us extraordinarily happy. What
mhm,
they also do is give us a dramatically longer lifespan. One recent study showed that the lifespan difference between people with good habits, both mental and physical, and those who have bad habits, mental and physical, the lifespan difference in this very, very recent study done as part of a veterans project by the VA, the lifespan difference was 24 years.
mhm.
Think about that.
Oh, my
24-year
God.
difference between Hug and Gug. So right now, we don't have to deal with tigers on the path like Hug and Gug had to deal with.
Mhm,
If we learn to develop all of those circuits in our brains and have a healthy lifestyle, the difference in lifespan is 24 years, and the difference in health span is even longer because those people who live to that advanced old age also tend to be healthier toward the end of life than the ones that die early. So don't think that that negative thought you're allowing yourself to think, or that depressed moment you're having, or that horror movie you're watching is having no effect. All of these things are having the tiny incremental effects every day. Over time, they produce radical differences in health and in lifespan.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard someone say that in order to heal, you have to feel to a degree. And so certainly when we have trauma or grief, or some sadness, some of these are natural, maybe emotions that come to the surface. We could identify them as negative, whatever that is. Like, how do you feel that people should relate to a negative thought or a sad emotion? Should you try to bypass that, or should you try to just constantly reframe it, or should you, exhaust some degree of compassion and awareness towards, that thought or feeling?
You tap. You have That's what that veteran did who was thinking about the firefight when he heard the bottle being crackled. We tap. We just have them tap. In fact, what we do in EFT training, this acupressure tapping training we do, I train hundreds of therapists and coaches and professionals, school teachers and corporate wellness people every year, and we simply have them focus on that and tap. And it's counterproductive because we actually have them, rather than trying to avoid the negative thought, which they've been tending to do for the previous
Mhm.
period of time, we have them actually focus on it, because we want to get all those neural circuits of stress lit up in their brain. What we see on an EEG when we have them hooked up, their brains hooked up to these devices, is when they are thinking these negative thoughts, their emotion system gets highly activated in their brain. And when they start to apply acupressure tapping to these points, it's like popping a balloon. It's just amazing how quickly their emotions regulate and that stress just dissolves. But you have to evoke the stress, you have to light up the neural pathways, get them firing first, and then you tap. So we have all kinds of ways to actually drive people into recalling even the minute details of the most traumatic events of their lives,
Mhm.
but they're applying acupressure tapping while they are doing it. And again, that's lighting up those emotional centers and then popping the balloon. And you just do that over and over and over again. We'll have a veteran walk into uh, one of our therapists or coaches. They'll have a list of 79 traumatic events in their
Mhm.
lives that have caused them immense grief and stress. And we just work with them one after the other on event after event, just focusing on the event, on the most triggering details of the event, and tapping. Now their body is getting two conflicting signals. So the brain gets one signal from the firefight in Iraq, the traumatic event, whether it's a car crash, bad divorce, death in the family, whatever it might be. That's going into their cognitive centers and triggering all
Mhm.
of the activity of the emotional brain. A second signal then arrives at the emotional brain from the body, which is this soothing somatic signal of
Mhm.
tapping on acupressure points. And at that point, the brain has to reconcile two competing signals, one of which is saying, go into stress mode, go into fight or flight, go to high cortisol. And the other one is saying, you're okay. Everything's
Mhm.
fine right now. You're safe. And when you get these two competing signals, one from the memory and the other one from the body, it prioritizes the body one. It knows the body one is real. And so that cancels the emotional tagging around the traumatic thought. And after you break that association between that thought and going to fight or flight one time, our long-term studies of traumatized people show that you break it one time and usually it stays broken forever. So you go talk to those Holocaust survivors or those victims now, a year, 10 years later, their numbers are still way down because we've broken that association between the traumatic events and the physiological stress response with the tapping, and it tends to stay broken. So what you want to do is face your worst fears, but tap while you're doing it.
Right. Be like the buffalo, go to the storm, right? you know?
Goodness,
So,
sure. Yes.
yeah. So, I mean, so for viewers listening who might think, "Hey, I've been through just so much. I'm old. You can't teach an old dog or an old brain new tricks." It seems like it's possible for anyone, no matter how big of a stressor you're going through, that maybe it's not perfect, but you could have some degree of moving the needle, in your brain, in your life, in your well-being of change, and so that is possible, it seems, right?
Absolutely. And we had hypothesized that it would be easier for younger veterans with less length of time firing those circuits of trauma than for older veterans. So, in some of our research, we've compared older veterans and younger veterans. And the hypothesis was that it'd be much easier for the younger veterans who have, say, been out of the war for 2 years
Mhm,
than work with a Vietnam veteran for whom it's been 50 years. And we've actually found we have not picked up a difference. We find that acupressure stimulation works equally well for all those groups. So
mhm,
you absolutely can shift, even if you're 60, 70, 80 years old. We've even worked with veterans who are in their 90s and find that I mean, it's been, I'm just tearing up here, Jacob, as I think about one particular veteran that our volunteers worked with around 2000. And he was a former Nazi SS officer,
mm,
and what he had done in the war was
mhm,
horrendous. He wouldn't even talk about it. We had to work with him replaying these things silently in his mind. And again, here's a man who'd lived with the horror of being a perpetrator of
mhm.
atrocities for all those decades, and yet he was able to release that and learn to smile and learn to love. Actually, it was his daughter and his family, and really reconnecting with
Mhm.
everybody in the last few years of his life. So yeah, it does work even for people at that stage and that age.
Yeah, people capable of sociopathic tendencies could
Yep.
develop degrees of mirror neurons, empathy, self-realization, forgiveness. It just shows you that life is a evolutionary process. Or sometimes we get very far away from who
Yeah.
we are, remember who we are, and find that space to forgive, grow, and learn. But amazing because, yeah, people will identify live in a very binary world of good and evil, and people identify that, and it's not every evil person that that commits evil acts. Sometimes people are just very neurologically damaged or disconnected, and it seemed from your illustration that people are able to have that reset and come back to foundations of who they really are, and that's if that is possible in a microcosm, imagine the macrocosm of that, and how that could be spread. Um, just quickly before we go, I know we've unfolded a lot, so much powerful information that you've shared. I think we live in a little bit of a microwavable society where people are always on the go and they need something quick to reset in a way. And certainly I live in New York, it's kind of like that here. But for people listening or watching, quickly, are there any like microwavable, I don't like to use the word coping skills, but any like, techniques or practices to sum up our conversation that people could utilize and activate in their lives? And, you know, I'm sure you have, books, based in this, but any like quick things that people could use to really rewire, change their brains or their neurobiology?
Well, one of the components of eco meditation that you can use standalone without needing to do the full routine of all 5 techniques is very, very simple. And that is to relax your tongue on the floor of your mouth. And that's all you do. Just relax your tongue. You can try this right this very moment. Just think about any triggering event in the last couple of weeks that you remember, and think about that event and then score it from 0 to 10. So, was it a 10 out of 10 emotion? Was it a 7 out of 10, 3 out of 10 emotion? And give it a score, give the event a score of 0 through 10. Then relax your tongue on the floor of your mouth and keep it relaxed. Think about the event again and try and raise your number. And so do that right now. Think about the event. And if you were 5 earlier, see if you can get to a 6. See if you can
Mhm.
get to a 7. Now, the chances are, as long as you keep your tongue relaxed, you won't even be able to get to 5. You're going to find your number is going to drop just by relaxing your tongue. And that's one of the very simple techniques within eco meditation. Why does it work? Because the nerves in the base of the tongue run and connect with the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve goes all over the body. And so your tongue being relaxed tells your whole body there's no threat in the here and now. And when you remember the triggering event, it tells your body that right now that event is not a threat to your survival. So there are simple techniques like that. There are several others that build on each other in eco meditation, but that's one example. So if you have a situation that triggers you throughout the day, maybe you hate your commute and you get all tense while you're going home on the train or the bus or your car, just try relaxing your tongue. When you're maybe you're dealing with a family member, an elderly parent, a teenage child, and you're getting triggered, relax your tongue. That one thing alone will send that signal to your vagus nerve, and it'll relax you. So there are lots of simple physiological hacks like that that are that simple and yet can help us shift.
Allows people to take their power back too, versus the power from other external stressors. And yeah, I love it. Will, you've really unpacked so much, and you've been one of my more fascinating, experienced, intellectually stimulating guests that we've had, and you've really been able to really demystify the brain and mental health. And I know this is gonna go well with viewers. Is there any the best what would you say is the best way to reach you, as well as finding some of your books or upcoming events? Where would be the best place to find Dr. Dawson Church?
Mhm.
And all that will be in descriptives, but yeah.
Two places. One is to download that free eco meditation track. Go to Dawson, just my name, DAWSON, gift.com. And that'll get you the free eco meditation track and also the tapping acupressure manual. It's a very short manual, and you can just read it and try it yourself on any recent stressors. So DawsonGift.com is one easy place to get access to that. You're then in my website, and we have all of our certified practitioners. We have live events, we have virtual events, in-person events. We have trainings at Kripalu and Omega, CIIS on the West Coast. All these trainings going on all over the world. So virtual and in-person events. Also, our practitioners are certified. They're trained. They get recertified every 2 years, so they really know the stuff. They're trained in trauma from the very first part of their training. So you can find all of our practitioners through that DawsonGift.com link. But again, just download those two resources, and that'll get you going on both tapping and meditation. And then for my book, Spiritual Intelligence, that's just spiritualintelligencebook.com. So make sure you have the word book in there, spiritualintelligencebook.com, and you can download the first 2 chapters for free at that site, or you can order the book as well. And then that's going to give you a whole bunch of more resources, including it'll unlock a whole series uh, of 7 meditations for you that are also free, as well as many other scientific resources, all through spiritualintelligencebook.com. You'll also get a video of the 4 most important circuits of the awakened brain and how to turn those on inside your own brain. So that's at spiritualintelligencebook.com.
Yeah. And by going to all these .coms, I'm sure will find the com, right?
You'll find the
So,
calm.
well, Dr. Dawson, thank you so much for all your time and your powerful words. And we'd love to have you back at any moment in time. It was a true pleasure. And I'm sure you're on social media sites, so please do check out his website as well, too. You can find him social media and try to contact, as well, follow upcoming events. So pleasure to have you on, and a true honor to hear your words today.
It's a joy. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for sharing all of these wonderfully positive and optimistic perspectives with your community. We need that in the world right now. So thanks for sharing.
Amen. The world needs love and positivity. Thank you. Well, thank you all for tuning in to a very informative, educational, and uplifting conversation that I know many will come out taking a lot of powerful tools and techniques and more brain awareness, mental health awareness, as well as spiritual and physical awareness and actualization through this conversation. So thank you, Dr. Church, for your decades worthy of work and literally changing the world and the sphere of how we understand mental health and the brain and spiritual activation in our lives. So thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you tune into the Wisdom Jacob's Ladder for our next guest episode. And we love having you here continually to climb the ladder of ascended awareness, elevation, and improved sense of information in our lives. As we've learned from the interview, the quality of life in many ways, the quality of our beliefs and information. And I'm sure you were able to take in a lot of helpful, profound, research based information through the brain and beyond. Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll see you here next time.